Hello, this is Mike Swanson. This is a segment of the past American century. Got a very special guest with me today. I'm speaking of Carmine Savastano, the author of Two Princes and a King. How you doing today, Carmine?
I'm good, Mike. Good to be back.
Yeah, it's been a couple weeks since we last spoke, and I just thought just kind of have an informal talk and talk about some things we're reading and researching, and because you've been reading some interesting books, and so have I.
Yeah. There's definitely as we've discussed before, I don't necessarily spend a lot of time reading the books on, with rare exceptions, like one of the books you're going to talk about, John Newman's new book. There's definitely some good research you can get on occasion, but for the most part, like I learned from you and Chuck, having between the two of you read hundreds of books, that a lot of the books, especially the older ones before the Assassination Records Review Board happened, are basically 70%, not all of them, but a large majority are 70% the same book. You're really just hearing a retelling of all the things that most of us already know already. So you want to be selective, and conversely, with like the stuff we're going to talk about, it's not necessarily of primary importance, but there are little parts of the story I think you can learn from the occasional really well-written or informative book that you can't find necessarily in the official files, or you're not going to hear it directly from those people while they're in office. They're going to wait 20 years to really give their true opinion of what's going on.
Well, in a way, I've got two books in front of me, and I'm thinking about the one you're going to talk about. And in a way, if I stack these three books together, they're different in the degree of usefulness to, I think, a general reader.
Yeah.
So, like the first book, and I'm still reading this. It's called Vietnam: An Epic Tragedy. It came out a couple months ago, and it's by someone named Max Hasting. And there was another book that came out at the same time, which I did a whole hour-long talk with Chuck about it on his show, called Road to Disaster. Now I'm talking three books, but I just want to talk about two. But these two books came out at the same time. They're about Vietnam. They both had sold very well. But the thing about the Vietnam War is there hasn't been a one-volume book about the entire war that's really been published and been big since the 1980s. And that's Stanley Carnow's book. I mean, it may be the number one seller on the topic. And this is a huge topic with many books. So it's like the Kennedy assassination or the Kennedy presidency. Many books are written about it. It's a lot of people are interested in the Vietnam War, but this is the first book to come out about the whole trying to cover the entire thing. And really the Kennedy presidency, there isn't a book about the entire presidency that's come out for a very long time either. But the thing about this Hastings book is it may be the only book I've ever read that starts out in the introduction, and the guy says he's not using this is the quote, "I decided not to conduct primary political research. U.S. archives have been trawled by scholars for decades. That's his excuse." So he says at the beginning, he's not using any new documentation. He's not even looking at it. So what the book actually consists of, there's nothing original in it at all. There's very little meaningful interpretation of the war, the causes of the war, and what it really amounts to is just lots of first-hand accounts of soldiers from our side and the North Vietnamese side over and over and over again with not a whole lot of context. So it's written like, it's easy read, lots of quotes from people, and he's going into secondary sources to get these quotes, And he says he did go to, there's an Army museum in Carlisle with, you know, where they interviewed soldiers and all this stuff. So he's gone up there and gotten those records. He has interviewed a few people, like a couple CA people, but the book is written, I believe, to be a big seller and appeal to as many people as possible. And I think that's part of the reason why he did this. And he also praises this Ken Burns movie, which is kind of, in my view, what the movie did, try to appeal to the most many people as possible. But what I'm the reason I kind of bring this up and want to contrast it with what you're reading in this Newman book is here's a book that's a big seller, but it's like historically, like if you're an academic historian, it's valueless. Really, there's nothing because there's nothing new in it. But to the general public, you know, it's weird. It's kind of strange because I don't know. It's kind of
Well, it's a
weird.
good. It sounds like it's a good, like initial, for somebody who doesn't know anything.
Yeah,
Be a good,
basically.
yeah. For like just someone brand new to the subject, it might be a good starter book.
But it's
But yeah, you wouldn't recommend it to someone who actually knows something about the subject.
no, and it's almost written to not offend anyone or something, like not having any opinions. It's I don't, but then the opposite of this would be the Newman book, and I don't want to save time to talk about yours, but Into the Storm, the assassination of President Kennedy, is volume 3 of what is going to be in at least a 5-volume set. So just by those numbers alone, well, this isn't for the general public. They're not going to read 5 volumes on a topic. And here's a book that's using, very little secondary sources, pretty much documents from the archives. So it's like the complete opposite of this Max Hastings book, where it's really for the specialist that already knows something about the topic, which is the Kennedy assassination. And I did a review about it, and I'm just going to link to the review in this video. I did it a month or two ago when I read the book, but it's like you were saying when it comes to the topic of the assassination, have been so many books written and about it, and many of them have just repeated what other people have written, especially books that were written in the 80s and 1990s. They were primarily working off the HSCA volumes or investigation that happened in the late 70s into the assassination of Kennedy, and just repeating what was in the first authors were repeating what was in there, and then the future authors were repeating them. And Jim Marrs would be probably the best example of that because he wrote one of the biggest selling books, and it was mostly using the work of others. There's not necessarily anything wrong with that, but
But you
here's
want to provide new information too. You don't just want to repeat what everybody else said and then repackage it and sell it as if it's new information.
yeah, and here's finally a book this or a series by John Newman, and the third one is probably if anyone's listening and they want to start reading these books, I would actually recommend read this one first and then read his first and second one, because this one is actually, I think, the easiest one to get into. I really actually had trouble getting into the first one because the names weren't familiar to me, but this third one, most of the names, or a lot of them, should already be familiar to people that are already interested in the topic, and then they'll get deeper starting in 1 and 2, and by the time they're done in 1 and 2, hopefully the next one will be out, and I'm now really waiting to see what he's got to say. But in this one, he spends a lot of time talking about information he's found out about Operation Northwoods. And by the way, you also have a bunch of information about Mongoose and Northwoods on your website with documentation, which is real accessible to people. But he's got a lot of topics in here, and I learned a lot from it. One of the things that he showed me, which I really, or proved to me would be a better way to put it, was that he makes a very strong argument that the Kennedy administration and Robert Kennedy in particular were not behind the plots to kill Fidel Castro, that those plots actually started before they got in office, and people have
Well,
blamed for them, and he disproves that they're to blame for it.
well, and that's the correct assessment, I would contend, because if you look at the documents, we know for sure. Like I remember one of the first documents that I came across where I got into some controversy with a few people was when the CIA, when I found the list of all the CIA leaders that were appraised of the Castro plots, and the approvals came in '59, and that's the Eisenhower administration. And now I'm working on something. I'm going to put out a new article in a day or two, but I'm basically working on some of what was going on the Cuban side of those negotiations. And Richard Nixon proposed to Eisenhower it was something like March or April of that year, that they use Cuban exiles to overthrow the young revolutionary regime of Castro because he thought he was a communist.
Right.
So this is pre-Kennedy. None of that, none of those later plots. Everything was started during the Eisenhower administration, and basically Allen Dulles and other people in the CIA, and other leaders too, because there were other leaders associated in the military. They basically just kept this thing going under the pretext of the Kennedys saying, "Do what you can to go after Castro," not even informing them that this was an ongoing operation from the Eisenhower administration.
Yeah. No, and I didn't know that. In fact, the book I wrote, which was in 26 years ago now, I just, I didn't really go into these plots. I just quoted some remark by Richard Helms, blaming it all on the Kennedys or something, or making some sort of snide remark, and put that in there, and and then just went on to the next topic. And so that's something. If I went back and rewrote my book, I would probably take that out.
Well, and we can only operate on what's available to us. At the time, all those documents were still hidden, or they were buried in releases that weren't. I mean, that's one of the biggest problems, I think, with anybody who has to dig through some of these archives is it's actually the private associations or the nonprofits that have better archives than the National Archives. Like the National Archives has more files,
Yeah.
but they're not all accessible online. That's number one. So you have to go to the archives literally and make a trip across country, for most people anyway. And in some cases, people like Malcolm Blunt internationally travel to go to the archives. So, there's that. And then once you do, they do get some things online, like the new Kennedy releases. They're not organized in any way. And there's doubles. And, there's partial redactions in some things that aren't the same in others. So there isn't even a real consistent way, besides slogging file by file or randomly just, picking files, that you're going to find.
Yeah, Doug Campbell sent me.
So all that challenge, and then, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, Doug Campbell sent me or directed me to a section of the archives that aren't even indexed. Not even, that were released last year, or they're not even indexed.
Well, and I know that Rex Bradford and others have talked about that, and they've even pulled out parts of the collection and then thrown them back in the wrong place.
That's crazy.
So there's files that are messed up. There's files that have been checked out that never got checked back in. There's files that just got wiped out before they even got a hold of them, like, the Mexico City tapes with Oswald. There's stuff that was destroyed before any investigator even was able to appraise it. You just had to take the word of the organization, which proves to be a mistake at times.
Yeah.
They might not be lying to you why you think they're lying to you, but they're still lying to you.
Well, one thing, like, what I was thinking in the back of my mind is actually at the beginning of this about, here's three types of books, this Hastings books, the Newman book, and then what you're going to talk about is there are different in a certain sense. Well, I haven't read the book you're talking about, but it's like it's the memoirs of somebody, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's basically part commentary on the CIA, part travel log, kind of. It's the name of it is The Unknown CIA. It's by Russell Jack Smith, and he was a deputy director of the intelligence directorate for the CIA. So he was actually one of the top tier leaders for, I think, 5 years. And he also had a long-standing background in intelligence. He was a member of the Office of Strategic Services, which was a predecessor group to the CIA, for those who don't know. Um, he he's almost the classic, what you would imagine if you looked in, I'm trying to think of popular fiction that people would probably be more familiar with, like the James Bond series. He's a classic analyst, almost like he wouldn't be Q perhaps because Q, does all of the gadgets and all that sort of interesting stuff, pardon me. um, but he would be an analyst, a high-ranking analyst. He was somebody who worked his way up from the basic analytical structure as, just an academic, and got more and more steeped in, the agency and how it operated, and sort of tried to maintain sort of a moderate position instead of where, you look at somebody like Richard Helms or somebody like Alan Dulles, who, while they appeared to be fairly moderate academics, took rather extreme policy positions. They would, of course, not ever publicly say that they would do things like assassination, but we know from the files it's exactly what they did, even though they decried the Soviets doing the same thing.
Well, I think about these three different books here is that if you're in some ways, it's more valuable to read a book like you're talking about, a memoir, where a guy's talking about his experience over 3 decades in the CIA, than it is to read this book I'm reading about Vietnam, because it's just a collage of stories, and they're not really connected. It's not in some big interpretation. So
Yeah, it's not even giving you analysis opinions, which could
yeah.
be useful.
So I think someone would be better off to read one of the many, accounts individual soldiers have written about their individual experience in the Vietnam War, because then it is in at least some sort of uh,
Narrative.
narrative meaning instead of just these endless stories going on. And the Newman book is sort of like that too for a reader, because it's just so much information, that it's got a meaning to it. It's important information, and he's using a method to analyze it by like showing you, for example, what Antonio Veciana said at one time, contrasting it what he said in other times, and also with what people said about Robert Kennedy, to make different arguments. So it's really an analytical book about the topic, but there is something valuable about the type of book you're reading, where you get one person's narrative, and it's easier to grasp that in one read, and it's also, I think, important if you want to get a deep understanding of the Central Intelligence Agency, to get an idea of the personalities of these people, and maybe he does that.
Yeah, yeah, and no, I think he does a pretty good job of it. I don't think it's all intentional, which I think is always entertaining in a book when you can actually read between the lines. And you don't want to do too much interpretation, but from what I was able to gather from what Smith had written, he he was a very I think the reason why he was such a good analyst is because he saw a lot of the flaws and knew that some fights just weren't worth having. As far as you see a lot of times in some of the internal documents and the arguments of the leadership in many different government agencies, but the CIA in particular, that people took things very personally. And you know, it seems like the higher in government you go, the more personally they take even the slightest of affronts. And some of these people, you know, he interacted with some of what you would call the most aggressive and you know, stalwarts of the intelligence community. You know, he was around in the beginning, even before the beginning. He was around before the CIA, and he got to observe the fights that people had, and then he, unlike a lot of them, learned from the prior fights other people had when he had conflicts with people, and he was usually able to navigate without causing himself a whole lot of trouble or making permanent enemies with people that a lot of others made permanent enemies of, that it was just foolish to do so. So he was a pretty smooth operator for, you know, an academic. He didn't come off as a smooth person, but intellectually he was, you know, very precise, and he knew what he was doing. As far as his goal was not, as where a lot of people's egos get in the way, from, in my opinion anyway, his goal was not necessarily to, it's funny, I don't even think he wanted to become the deputy director of intelligence. It was just by chance that the opening occurred and it was offered, and against his own judgment he decided to take it, and he did it, you know, for less than a decade, and decided, he actually went to his boss and said, you know, I think you might want to find somebody else. I'm starting to get tired of this, which you don't see happen very often. Usually people cling to a management position and keep it as long as they possibly can. So I think that,
Who was
I'm
his?
sorry, go ahead.
Oh, who was he? Who was his boss?
In the 60s, I think it would have been,
Klein?
not McCone. Yeah, yeah. It would have been, well, no. It would have been McCone or whoever followed McCone. Helms. Yeah, Helms. It would have been Helms.
Was it? I mean, was Ray Klein above him?
He was above him, I think, earlier on. I
Oh, okay.
think Klein was one of the people who actually was one of his contemporaries.
So I guess then he probably took Klein's place.
Yeah. At that point, he might have. Yeah, I know. I know that he interacted with him. He interacted with Dulles, which is interesting because he didn't say anything bad about Dulles, but I don't think he particularly, you know, favored him. That he didn't really interact with him on a lot of people liked Alan Dulles because he was sort of the proto, you know, James Bond type spy. He was. It's what's interesting is he actually remarks about Dulles, and I think this is true, that he says that he wishes the CIA, original CIA, because Dulles wasn't the first CIA director, but I would say he's the first really famous CIA director.
Yeah, that's for sure.
And someone says Alan, yeah, usually you know that they're talking about the CIA, that he was a CIA director. Some people even think of him as being the first when he wasn't. But he's the first well-known. And what Smith says is that he thinks that the agency would have had a totally different historical trajectory if they hadn't have chosen Dulles and instead chosen an analyst. And it sort of reveals the interesting tug of war that still goes on between the analysis side and the operational side, where you have the analysts who are actually looking at the data and comparing it to other data and then trying to come to some sort of reasonable judgment or set of judgments that, you know, the best courses you can take. And then you have the operational side that wants to get something done, and they're not always going to agree with what the analyst's information is not going to agree necessarily with what they want to get done. And there's some people who don't care that the facts don't match with what they want to do. They want to do what they want to do anyway.
Well, that's the key thing. People, that that only know the CIA from movies and, well, I mean, and books. Which actually, that's all I know from movies and books myself. But but there's just the general view of the CIA is that I don't think most people understand that it's got two divisions to it. As you're describing, the analytical and what you call it,
Operation.
the
Yeah.
operations of it, and the analytical thing maybe the most important one.
Well, that's the basis it's supposed to be operating on. That's the funny thing about it, is that's what the CIA is for. We didn't create them to do assassination plots. They just decided to do that.
Yeah.
You're right. I mean, yeah, that's I mean, what it's in the name. The intelligence. That's what they're supposed to be doing, is gathering intelligence. Instead, we, like you and I were talking about a little bit before the show, how many times have contending analysis been ignored? I mean, it just quickly, like off the top of my head, you got the British overthrow of Mossadegh that we helped with Iran. We went against, the long-term consequences or any contending analysis that was a bad idea. The Bay of Pigs in Cuba. We almost started a nuclear war with Russia. The Tet Offensive, which basically was the final blow to our Vietnam campaign. We didn't forecast the collapse of the Soviet Union. We thought they were going to keep going on even after they were falling apart. 9/11, the pre-intelligence that was ignored. The Second Iraq War, that they had weapons of mass destruction, ignored. That they didn't have them, was ignored. Libya, that we thought we'd go in there and fix things, now it's a fallen state, ignored. Syria, we wanted to overthrow Assad. Analysis said that's a bad idea. There is no policy to do that. Obama and the military said, who cares? And now Yemen with Trump.
Well, I'll tell you. I mean, I just told. Well, that comes to the question of, is that the fault of the CIA, or is that the fault of the people outside the CIA who don't care about their information?
Unfortunately, I think it's both. I think, well, first of all, I think it's funny because I am not a fan, as you know, of a lot of these organizations because they're run so badly. And I don't know about modern analysts because I don't know anyone in the CIA, but I think that as far as historical analysts, at least people like Smith, they were doing their job.
Right.
They told them. They said, hey, guys, you might not want to charge right in because there's all these other things that might want to be considered as well. And the operational leaders, not all of them, there were some, I'm sure, and that's the thing. We can't say that they were all bad because there were successful operations that we don't know about. So there was good work being done in a lot of cases, but there were also these pet projects where they just basically ignored what the analysts said. They did them anyway, and we're still paying for them, not just in money and in lives, but we're paying for them in bad blood and diplomatic problems that we might forever have to deal with, like Iran. I mean, Iran doesn't need to be the way it is between us. The two countries don't need to hate each other like they do, but they both just incite over and over these historical things that most people don't even understand in modern times. Most people don't know that we are government anyway, not the people. And that's something I think that needs to be pointed out too, is this isn't the fault of the American people, and this isn't the fault of the Iranian people. This is the fault of our leaders. And the British didn't like that Mossadegh, the last democratically elected president of Iran, was going to nationalize their corporations and take the oil back for the country. So they convinced the CIA to help them, and we overthrew them. And that we installed the Shah, who created a really repressive, which, the people of Iran under tyranny for decades, And then that was overthrown by the Iranian Revolution, which ushered in a religious extremist group of people who basically now their descendants control the government, and we all hate each other. And none of it was necessary. And people are now still making up reasons why we hate each other that have nothing to do with the actuality of what happened, because no one knows the history. I mean, those are the real costs of these policies.
Well, I mean, just thinking about the CIA itself, I mean, it's if you go back to Harry Truman, they had a Harry Truman was getting this daily presidential briefing. You know, that's kind of famous.
Yeah.
He was
Yeah,
the first.
well, Smith was actually the guy who was one of the original writers of it.
Oh, wow. Well, from what well, is this in there? I mean, I read this somewhere that when Truman was getting this, the Soviets, the Chinese tested a, no, I'm sorry, the Soviets tested an atomic bomb, and then the Korean War happened, or the North Korea invaded South Korea, and Truman was real angry that the CIA didn't tip him off to this, and then was angry about this daily summary wasn't good enough, and they got Walter Beetle Smith supposedly to go in there and straighten things out and fix it. But if that account's true, the primary focus was still this analysis. And then by the time, as at some point immediately after then, it started to shift, and they got into this Iran business.
I'd say Eisenhower and Nixon were yeah, I'd say the Eisenhower administration was when it really changed.
Well, what's the Smith guy say about that?
Well, he talks about, I don't think a lot of people were fans of Nixon. He discusses some of the changes as far as when Bedell Smith got in charge, and I'm sure Bedell Smith was part of it too. I think as more military people were injected in, and they were always there to some extent, because originally in some of the books I'm reading now, and the Unknown CIA book complements them, but what I'm seeing is that originally the military didn't want the agency to be independent. It wanted it to answer to a committee of military officers and the State Department and other groups. They wanted to have some controls over the intelligence, and I think that becomes more apparent later on when you see what happens with these independent analysis, when the independent analysis occurs, I should say. And because they, in some respects, don't want independent analysis. They want you to give them the data that backs up what they want to do.
And justifies their budgets.
Exactly.
So they want, for example, the Soviet Union. I don't know. When did was he in there when Ford was in office?
No, I believe he retired before that. I think Nixon was the last president.
Well, I mean, the famous dispute, one of the famous intelligence disputes in the CIA would be after he left. Actually, they could have been blaming him for it if he was there when Nixon was there. But the neoconservatives wanted, and people in the military, they wanted to exaggerate the extent of the Soviet nuclear threat in the 1970s. I mean, they did this over and over again, because they did in the 50s with the bomber gap and the missile gap. And then there was a move to detente and some arms control treaties under Nixon, and they wanted to, and the CIA was giving these estimates that were correct about what the Soviets had and what they were doing.
Yeah, you're right.
But it wasn't good enough. So they had to dispute the CIA analysis and put their own people in there. It was just a total fiasco.
Well, and I was going to say that sparked a memory from the book that when I was reading it must have been just around the time when he left, because that happened a couple of times. I think it also happened with the missile gap in the 60s, where they put out analysis and the military would just automatically double their number.
Oh, the Air Force is horrible on it.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. The Air Force, I think they were saying we're almost quadrupling what they said, just because they needed to justify their programs. They needed it to be that big. And it was created in, it's basically if you have what would be an acceptable, structure for the computation you're doing, that essentially is all they needed. They just needed to say that number, we think you guys are wrong about this, increase the number, and then just extrapolate from there.
Right.
And,
It's a lot of imagination, it sounds like.
yeah, yeah, it's basically people, I hate to say it, but it just comes down to they didn't want to believe the analysis. They wanted it, they had their program kind of like with the Castro plots. I mean, they wanted to get rid of him, so they were prepared to inflate the threat to such an extent that it actually, when you think about it, almost created greater threats. We almost had atomic war because of the Bay of Pigs. I mean, at any point, Kennedy or Khrushchev could have made a mistake, or somebody on the ground could have gotten nervous. And if one of those subs would have fired, or one of our planes, after that U-2 got shot out of the sky, if we would have just automatically responded, we wouldn't be having this conversation. And that's the importance of analysis. You need to know what's going on. You shouldn't be operating upon false premises because you want to get something done rather than there's the assumed truth and then there's the actual truth. And a lot of these people made assumptions contrary to the actual truth of the data. So I think that's what we can still see in modern times. That's why I think it's important. Some people might be wondering, why are these books necessarily important? Well, I would think that at least the Unknown CIA book and the Newman book are important because they let you look into beyond what the classic narrative is of these groups that, first of all, we shouldn't just automatically assume they're right because they've been wrong so many times on important things. And that doesn't mean the analysis was wrong, but the policy was wrong. Somewhere between the data and what they did, things, they didn't follow what the actual truth was. They followed what the narrative was that they wanted to present.
Well, and then the result is not good.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, calamity.
but does he make out like there was a battle in the CIA between the analysis and the operations people over?
Yeah, yeah. Well, not not necessarily. What he, it's kind of funny because analysis, once it gets to operations, there's not really much the analysis people besides protest and in some cases resign, which happened too. I think a lot of people think that, every CIA person is some sort of schemer and most of analysis isn't. They're clear-headed, usually academics that are not, they don't like a lot of, it's funny, they talk about, one of the big conflicts is that the operations side saw the analysts as, just a bunch of elitist academics who didn't understand how things got done in the real world. And they, looked down upon them for that because they had never served in the field. And the academics looked at them as just a bunch of, brazen James Bond wannabes who didn't really have any education and, didn't respect, the difficulty of analysis when they were forming these, spy plans to go off and slink into the darkness and stab somebody with their dagger. So and I think that's probably still an issue. I don't know necessarily if it's, under the exact same parameters, but I would guarantee there are people definitely now, imagine being one of the people who came forward during one of these crises, like the Syrian war. Like when they were, I would have loved to have been in the room because it had to have been somebody who didn't know anything about the 1960s and the Castro plots. Because could you imagine being an analyst who had that information, who knows about some of the things that we and others, in the field know about, and them saying, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to try to topple this foreign government. And, the first thing you could have said was, well, we've tried that in the past and it didn't really work out well. Here's this series of plots where we tried to assassinate a guy and topple his government, and, it just cost us tens of millions of dollars and lives and bad blood and, diplomatic failures and almost nuclear war. And they'd have been like, oh, okay, well, this is going to be different. So, and then they, go on with the plan a little bit more. And they're like, so what we're going to do is we're going to send the CIA in to help these rebels. And the rebels, some of them being terrorists, are going to overthrow his government, by inciting a popular revolution. And then that person can be like, hey, you remember those Castro plots I was talking about? They did all this already. And none of it worked. It just caused more problems. and look at what's happened. I'm not saying that, people who go with conspiracy in this way are not paying attention to the facts. It is false to say the CIA created terrorist groups that emerged like ISIS. That is false. But it is not false to say the CIA inciting, the members of extremist groups and funding them to try to kill Assad did influence the formation of ISIS. That's true. If they hadn't have gone in and empowered these people, we wouldn't have to have fought them, like similar to the Mujahideen in the 80s when we funded bin Laden and all of those people to go against the Russians, and then later on they came back and struck us. So we seem to keep creating these Frankensteins and then having to go back and take them out, and we don't learn from it.
Well, hopefully they will eventually. Or just...
Well, do they want to? I think is a question. I don't know if they want to.
Right.
Yeah, it's troubling to say the least. It's, and I know we've gone to an interesting place, hopefully, for the listener from just the book reviews, but I think that's what these books, you might not think that off the top of the bat, that's what you can get from these books, but I really do think that is what I got from them, is you see the patterns happening over and over, and I don't understand how all these, supposedly highly intellectual, well-qualified people can't seem to get the basic message, the gist of this historical lesson yet.
Well, they're just, there's many possible reasons why, but they certainly aren't reading the book you're talking about and getting lessons from it. And they're just looking after, what's their incentive? It's tough.
Well, yeah. Well, that's the thing. I think Smith and some of the, people can talk about the, and there definitely was, a stringent and not always reasonable stripe throughout a lot of these leaders. They did want to be argued with. They just wanted you to follow policy. I understand that, but there were also leaders, and I think Smith was one of them, who were willing to set aside that egotism and say, this is what the facts say. At the end of the day, we should go by what the facts say, not by what we want to do. And if you constantly ignore the facts and just do whatever you feel like doing, you're going to get so far removed from them one day that it might be too late. You might not be able to fix all the damage you've done.
Well, one of the problems with that, though, is that the people that cause this damage that aren't going by the facts, they're sitting in Washington, D.C. most of the time.
Yeah.
and the people that are going to go and fight these wars or do the covert operations and take the chances, they're not the ones making the decisions. And the ones making decisions aren't the ones taking the risks. So they don't have, they're not going to pay the consequences.
It kind of reminds me of I don't know if you've ever. There's a song by Tom Waits called "Hell Broke Loose," and in the song he says, "Why is it that everyone responsible for creating this mess is sitting behind a damn desk?"
Well, that sums it
When he's
up.
talking about the war.
Yeah.
Yeah, and but that's a problem. I mean, that's why we need more internal oversight of some of these military and intelligence groups. Maybe this isn't just a wait till it gets so bad that we do something. Maybe this is, and I understand there's the Senate subcommittee on intelligence, but essentially, what are we doing? We're just asking people who are constantly in contact and friends with the intelligence community to look over them. Good luck with that. That hasn't really worked out well. So maybe we need a public oversight committee, or maybe we need an
Well,
independent
we're going in,
expert committee.
we're going in the opposite direction because just to point out one example, they had that CIA torture scandal.
Yeah,
Uh, when Obama was president, it broke out, and the Senate had some hearings. They made a report, and part of the thing we found out was that they were misled by the CIA, and one of the main people involved is now the director.
yeah, Gina Haspel.
Trump made her the director, so he's not concerned with this kind of thing. But I'm not saying it's his fault, but
Well, even if he
the,
knows about it.
the Trump definitely, going opposite the direction of what you were saying we need to go in.
Yeah, and it's a problem, and it's ironic that he would do that after all the complaints he has about the deep state and intelligence middle managers coming after him.
Yeah,
It is highly ironic that he would put her. And I'm sure she's qualified and everything, but she also was one of the people involved in the torture scandal. And I think the reason why no one, I mentioned this when I was talking to Chuck, I think a couple of weeks ago, but I said that the reason why leaders on the Democratic side never really came out and tried to do a trial or conduct real in-depth, transparent investigations into the torture mess was because some of them signed off on it. They were briefed. They knew.
yeah, that's true. Sure, you're
You
right.
know? Yeah, they don't want it. They don't want the public backlash on themselves because they were part of it.
Well, that would be the leaders of the.
So, yeah, I mean, they can't cry ignorance on it. So they don't want to go into it because then the problem isn't just the other side. Because that was, a political football that they used during the Bush presidency, which they were right to say that they were wrong for doing it and that it shouldn't have been done and something should have happened. And, when people called George Bush and, Dick Cheney war criminals, they weren't necessarily entirely wrong. There were some things done that did break some of the Geneva Convention and other things in their pursuit of Saddam Hussein and bin Laden. So, I'm not going to make a judgment on that. I'm just going to say you can't, claim that you're against the deep state and then put one of the deep state's poster children in charge of the CIA. And, personally, like we've discussed before too, I don't believe there is this. I believe there are, of course, you can call them whatever you like, but long-term middle management actors in the intelligence agencies, yes, that do exert undue influence. But I don't think there's this big group who meets in a shadowy room. I don't think the classic deep state is necessarily accurate. It's become more of a movie style understanding rather than it's probably just smaller groups of people with like-minded interests who will manipulate the system to benefit themselves.
Well, that might be the topic of the so-called deep state. Maybe that's something we should do a whole discussion about. Because the meaning of it has changed too. That would be worth doing a video on at some point. Uh,
Okay. Yeah, no, it sounds good. I'm always interested, in talking about the intelligence community and just, the development and the evolution of it. I think that's something that it is interesting to focus on the operations, and that is going to reveal a wealth of information. But I think that it's also important, like you were saying, to know not only just the structure, but how things worked and some of the people, because they're not all one way. There's a lot, it's people are totally different, and there's a lot of different people early on, and things didn't have to be the way that they were. I think that's what I think one of the most important things in Smith's book is that he says originally it was just supposed to be about analysis, that operations were a very small part of it, and that little operational unit from the OSS ended up growing, and I think the SSU, which was another special operations unit, but basically they ended up growing to a really eminent position that was never intended for a group that was supposed to be focused on intelligence analysis.
and then they got the big. The funny thing about this too is, or one of the funny things, in the 1940s, all the CIA location was basically in Washington D.C. on the mall. Uh,
Hmm.
just these little buildings and tents and stuff. Well,
Yeah.
shacks, more like shacks. And then, they didn't even have this giant building that they got now. I mean, so that tells you how it grew.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, it's funny too because it wasn't in this book. I think they talk a little bit about it, but in some of the other book, or actually maybe it was in some of the documents that I read, some of the internal documents where they complained about the earliest accommodations they had because there was like leaks that would ruin information that they'd have to stack on the floor because they run out of table space, and there was a bad smell that was permeating, and mold, and just ridiculous things that would never happen now that they had to deal with because I mean people forget that they haven't always been this monolith. They were just a little tiny agency to begin with, that were underfunded, and were scrabbling just to keep things moving for a while until they got relocated.
Right. Well, I will let you go. We've been talking. I don't want to keep you. We've been talking for like almost an hour. So, uh,
Yeah, no, I'm surprised. I thought this was going to be a shorter one, but yeah,
yeah,
there was definitely hopefully interesting information for the listener. But I think there's definitely something to be said for not just reading one type. You're going to need multiple types of input, and that isn't to say that you should believe everything that's in a book. Still check on it with other sources, but you're not going to get the insights from specific people unless you actually let them tell you a little bit about their own story.
and it just makes it more interesting in a way too.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for taking the time to talk to me and everyone else. We'll do another interview soon.
Okay. I'll talk to you guys soon. Have a good one, Mike.